Hey, and welcome to the Bossed Up Podcast, episode 550. I'm your host, Emily Aries, the founder and CEO of Bossed Up. And today I want to talk about what two major companies, Deloitte and Zoom, have done in recent months to make significant changes to employee benefits. While there's been some media coverage of this already, I really don't feel like the press has come close to capturing just how alarming this change is, especially the precedent it sets for women and the roles that women tend to dominate. Because what's happening at Zoom and Deloitte isn't just about companies trimming a perk. This is about a new precedent being set, one where certain employees are told that they matter more than others. And the employees who are being told they matter less, well, they're disproportionately women. So let's break down the facts. Starting in January of next year, Deloitte is cutting benefits for employees based in its center model, which tends to be internal support staff. We're talking about departments like IT, finance, administration, HR, and marketing. These employees will see their paid family and medical leave slashed from 16 weeks to 8, so cut in half. Their annual PTO will drop by 1 to 2 weeks. And they'll lose access to a $50,000 stipend that currently supports family building efforts like IVF, surrogacy, and adoption. Meanwhile, employees who are in client-facing or client-serving roles, their benefits will stay exactly the same. Now, the company Zoom made a similar move recently. Birthing parents will now get 18 weeks of paid leave instead of 22 or 24, and non-birthing parents see their benefits drop from 16 weeks to 10. Google's former head of HR, Laszlo Bock, was recently quoted as saying that when companies of this size and profile make such a move, it, quote, legitimizes that action for everybody else. And that's what scares me the most here. It's not the end. This is just the beginning of a massive benefits rollback. Now, here's what the media coverage is totally missing. When you look at who actually occupies those Deloitte center-based roles, the ones who are getting their benefits cut, those are HR, marketing, administration, and finance support type roles. With the exception of IT, which has historically been male-dominated, these are all pink-collar jobs, a term coined in the 1970s to describe roles disproportionately filled by women. The data shows that these are massively dominated by women. According to the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 73% of HR managers in the US are women. And among HR generalists, the people who actually administer your benefits and process your leave and handle your employee onboarding, that number actually jumps up to 86% women, according to a study from PayScale. In-office and administrative support roles more broadly have almost always been filled by women. Women currently make up 70% of those roles. So those numbers aren't really close calls. Those are roles overwhelmingly dominated by women. And as we've discussed on this very podcast, those are the exact same pink-collar jobs that are more and more exposed to AI automation. And now we're seeing those same roles become vulnerable to benefit rollbacks too. Now, the benefits they're losing aren't just gym memberships or free lunches. These are major life-altering benefits. Parental leave, IVF funding, PTO. These are life stage benefits, the ones that determine whether you can start a family or recover from childbirth or care for a sick child without losing your job. So when a company cuts parental leave and fertility support for roles that women are much more likely to occupy, that's a gendered impact, regardless of whether the policy talks about gender or not. Susan Colantuono, who's a leadership expert, recently coined a term for exactly this kind of a corporate doublespeak. She talks about it in a piece that she published in April on her Substack newsletter, Be Business Savvy, that kind of went viral. The term she coined is gender scrubbing, using neutral language to hide a gender-adverse impact. And in doing so, you escape accountability for the harm that's being caused. I'll link to her piece in the show notes because it's essential reading. Both companies, Deloitte and Zoom here, frame the impact of these cuts as falling on support roles, which is technically accurate and still reprehensible in my book. But when you know that those caregivers and support roles are overwhelmingly held by women, that neutral language starts to feel like erasure. Susan's piece went viral on LinkedIn with hundreds of comments from HR professionals and working women. And one commenter wrote something I have not been able to get out of my head. They wrote, quote, "When corporations erase the word women from the conversation, they erase their accountability for the disproportionate harm they're causing." I want to spend a minute on this whole concept of a two-tier benefit structure too, because that's part of what makes this a super dangerous precedent that corporate America is now setting. To be fair, two-tier benefit systems have existed before among full-time, let's say, versus part-time employees, or exempt versus non-exempt workers. They have different benefits packages often, and that's just how business works, which I understand. But there's a difference between those existing models and what Deloitte just did, and I think it's really important to call that out. The full-time versus part-time distinction is based on hours worked. You work fewer hours, you get a proportionately different package. It's imperfect and it has its own fair share of equity problems, but the logic is at least tied to a measurable, consistent input. Exempt versus non-exempt employees, those are legal classifications established under the Fair Labor Standards Act. And the benefits differences that flow from that distinction are really established by labor law, federal law. But what Deloitte just did is totally different and much more subjective and a little sneaky, if you ask me. They created their own tier-based system based on the role alone, specifically based on how close your job is to generating client revenue. So if you're client facing, you keep your full benefits. And if you're in a support function, you don't. Same company, same salaried full-time employment status, potentially the same hours, the same tenure, the same performance rating. The only difference is your proximity to revenue generation. And that's what makes this such a dangerous precedent. It's not tiering by hours or by legal classification. It's a new two-tier system based on perceived value to the business. And perceived value, as we all know, is never neutral. It's shaped by the same biases that have undervalued pink-collar work for decades. Helen Sanderson, an expert in psychological safety, put it this way, quote, "Benefits aren't just compensation. They're one of the most visible ways an organization tells employees whether it sees them as whole people or as line items to be optimized." So when you remove parental leave and IVF funding from a particular group, one that's overwhelmingly women, you're making a public statement about whose wholeness, whose humanity the organization is willing to invest in. What's shocking to me about this is how overt this distinction is, how shameless this benefits cut is, and how livid I would be if I were working for one of these companies. Because even though we know pay gaps are real, like pay gaps are at least insidious because they're often unknown and secret. You often don't know who's making more than others at your company. But a two-tier benefit structure, everyone knows about it. It's policy, it's public, it's on paper. It sends a very clear message that no amount of, oh, we value all of our employees kind of doublespeak can undo. They're basically saying on paper that if you are client facing, you are more important and we care about keeping you more. And if you're in a support function or an overhead role, we fundamentally don't care if you like us or not, if you want to stay or not. If, we have to replace you, so be it. And that is just such an overtly disrespectful and it feels to me discriminatory claim based on perceived value. Like whose job is more important? The person in facilities who's cleaning the office and enabling the rest of the team to do what they do every day, or the person who's on the phone talking to the client and whining and dining the client over lunch, It is just a wild, wild thing where they're really saying the quiet part out loud nowadays, aren't they? Now, the other context we got to keep in mind for this whole discussion is that the global picture kind of makes this even more outrageous. As a reminder, the United States is the only developed nation without a national paid parental leave policy. The only federal protection we have is the FMLA, the Family and Medical Leave Act, which guarantees up to 12 weeks of job protection while giving you unpaid leave. which doesn't do most anybody any good. And that only even applies to you if your employer has 50 or more employees. So almost half of American workers don't even qualify for FMLA. So when Deloitte and Zoom cut paid parental leave benefits, they're not just trimming the excess on top of a strong social safety net, right? There is no safety net for American workers. We're almost entirely at the mercy of our employers for coverage. And now employers feel like they have the ability in a labor market that is benefiting employers and is in employers' favor, they can pull back on the golden era of perks and benefits. In Sweden, by contrast, parents get 480 days of shared parental leave paid. In Canada, up to 18 months, and in the US, 0. So when we talk about this rollback, we cannot forget that broader global context. We're not talking about companies going from generous to slightly generous benefit packages for their white collar workers, right? We're talking about companies chipping away at benefits that are, for many employees, the only thing standing between them and needing to go back to work days after giving birth. Our country's complete lack of caregiving infrastructure was already failing women before Deloitte and Zoom decided to make it worse. And I am seriously worried about the ramifications this has for other companies who are just like salivating at the savings possible if they follow suit. I mean, the sad reality is that we've seen that kind of domino effect happen before. When major employers started rolling back all their DEI commitments, a lot of others followed. When return to office mandates started at a few big tech companies, it became a wave. So when employers like Zoom and Deloitte make these kinds of moves, it gives everyone else permission to do the same. And now we have two-tier benefits based on their own judgment around whose job matters more. If that precedent holds, we are looking at a future where your access to parental leave, fertility support, and PTO depends not on your loyalty or your tenure or even your performance, but how close you are perceived to be to the revenue line. And because women are concentrated in roles that care for the company, care for the team, that provide the overhead support that keeps the company operating and keeps the world turning, like the company's now saying we don't value that work. And that is just another way in which this world is saying we don't value women. This is becoming, in actuality, a pink collar benefits tax because women will pay more in lost benefits and lost security and will be further squeezed out of the paid workforce altogether, despite doing the kinds of work that keep companies running. So what can we actually do with this information? First, I would encourage you to pay attention to what's going on in your company, especially when it comes to your benefits trends that you're noticing from your HR department. So if your company announces benefits changes, don't just read the summary. Lean in and ask who's affected, which roles, which departments. Disaggregate that data by gender. Ask them if they know how many women at the company will be impacted versus other folks at the company. And if the impact falls disproportionately on women, name that. Don't let gender scrubbed language do the work of hiding it. Secondly, know your market value always and be ready, not just when you're job hunting. Because women who know exactly what they're worth outside of their current organization have more leverage inside it. Benefits rollbacks target the people who the company believes have nowhere else to go. So do everything you can to make sure that's not you. Third, let's advocate loudly for the benefits that matter. Paid parental leave, IVF support, PTO, these aren't perks. A KinderCare study found that 85% of employees view childcare benefits as being on par with healthcare and retirement benefits. These are foundational. And if your organization is considering cuts, make the business case as to why that's short-sighted. And to help, one of my favorite think tanks in DC, New America, compiled case studies showing when Google extended paid leave from 12 to 18 weeks, attrition among young mothers dropped by 50%. When Accenture went from 8 to 16 weeks, it dropped by 40%. So there is a strong business case because attrition is expensive and replacing people, especially tenured professionals who've been with you for a while, is a very pricey proposition. And finally, we all have to keep the bigger picture in view. We have to push for paid leave at every level, local, state, and federal. And you can learn more about how to advocate for these kinds of things via our Take Action page at bossedup.org/takeaction. Because the fact that American workers are this dependent on individual employer generosity for something as basic as paid parental leave is a policy failure. And it's a policy failure that is squeezing women out of the workplace. So here's what I want to leave you with. Deloitte has an entire in-house initiative called Empowerful Women, dedicated to, and I'm reading this straight from their website, supporting equal access to professional opportunities for women, end quote. They publish an annual Women at Work report, and they partner with Catalyst. And yet, at the very same time, they create a two-tier benefit system that disproportionately strips parental leave and fertility support from the roles that women are most likely to hold. The gap between what companies say about women and what they do to women has never been wider. That is the story. And until we name it loudly, specifically, and without letting gender-neutral language give anyone cover, it's going to keep getting worse. I would love to hear what's going on in your organization. How is your company doubling down on women, supporting women in the workplace? Please give me some hope. Or rolling back the very kinds of policies that made it possible to be a working woman and or working parent in 2026. We got to call it like we see it, and I would love to hear from you. So let's keep the conversation going after the episode, as always, in the Bossed Up Courage community on Facebook or in the Bossed Up group on LinkedIn. And until next time, let's keep bossin' in pursuit of our purpose, and together, let's lift as we climb.